Hi everyone, I hope that you're all doing well. In this lecture, I want to introduce qualitative analysis techniques for social sciences to you. The plan for the lecture is this. We're going to go back over qualitative research. We've already done this once before at the start of this lecture series, but I want to give you a sense of what this term means, especially in contrast to the term quantitative research, which we've been pursuing for the last few weeks. So we'll start with a review of some traditional ways of viewing the qualitative-quantitative distinction and what I think is wrong with them. I'll supply an alternative definition. The actual definition that I would give is something like this. Qualitative data involves using people's own words. It involves firsthand, in some sense, collection, almost always. That's not always the case, but in the rare instances where people use qualitative data in a second-hand way, they at least have the person's own writing. So things like maybe analyzing diary entries or analyzing maybe people's memoirs or something like that. But typically speaking, we're getting people as they choose to express themselves. We're not forcing their responses into a fixed format so that we can more easily do numeric analysis, which is what is a hallmark of quantitative analysis. The analysis of qualitative data is typically concerned with meaning making, so how people experience reality and their subjective reasons for acting the way that they do. If you read the Orn and the Bell reading for this week, you'll note that this is kind of a fuzzy line sometimes. So the line between explanatory analysis and what they call subjective analysis. So basically reporting people's internal motivations versus trying to give the objective reasons for why they act the way that they do, that line is often very fuzzy. And so qualitative data really kind of jumps right in there. Quantitative data, by contrast, is generally speaking associated with the use of form responses, which facilitates numeric analysis. And the analysis is often concerned with the association between two things net of other factors, which is typically held to be definitionally equivalent to causality. So if A is associated with B net of some set of controls Z, where Z could include Z is typically a vector of variables, that would mean that A causes B then in this analysis without any reference necessarily to a person's internal motivations, for instance. So then we'll talk about qualitative approaches to sampling and analysis. Sampling and analysis can both be characterized simply in the following way. Many different approaches replace the assumption of random sampling, and the use of statistical inference, other kinds of inference, are done in the case of qualitative analysis. Finally, I'll discuss interviews a little bit. We're not going to conduct interviews in the class for which I'm producing this lecture, but I still want to give you a sense of basically how these things work. Fortunately, it's pretty straightforward. It's quite similar to conducting good surveys with the necessary changes being made, but we just don't have time to do these for our projects. By the way, if you're in this class, I will introduce the projects in the discussion tomorrow. So let's go back over quantitative versus qualitative in a little more detail. Remember that these terms are very common in social science. You'll hear them bandied about. Some people tend to oversimplify this. So they say things like quantitative data involves numbers in some sense while qualitative data do not. This runs into a variety of problems. So as mentioned before, we assign binary numbers to qualitative statuses in regression analysis all the time. It's one of the most common techniques. Conversely, few qualitative studies involve no numbers. So when you interview people or when you observe people, if you say observe a gathering in a church, for instance, or a synagogue or a mosque, or any religious ceremony you might observe, you'll probably count the people that you talk to, right? That's a form of basic numeric analysis. It's not very complicated. It's not strictly speaking statistical. It's just descriptive, but there's no attempt to do any inference, but that's still numeric analysis. Some other people say things like quantitative data involves measurement in some sense. For example, the book that we read at the start of the semester, Bryman. But qualitative scholars also do this. So to use the religious example again, we typically assess how religious people in a small group study might be if we're interested in religiosity. And finally, as we've seen before, quantitative data are gathered through surveys too, and wording is actually really, really important when it comes to survey research. So it's really hard to say that numbers matter in one form and words matter in another. This is often the way that these things are taught at a very introductory level, but I think this is oversimplification that goes so far as to be sort of useless. It prevents people from really thinking clearly about these issues. I do want to show you a little bit more of that traditional picture, though, just so you know what people are thinking of. So in the very oversimplified view of these things, quantitative research is associated with a whole sort of cluster of other approaches to research, or maybe you could even think about it as being comprised of this cluster. And the elements that make up this cluster would be numeric approaches, a deductive approach, so it is theory testing rather than theory generating. There's generally speaking a positivist epistemological orientation, meaning that people, generally speaking, try to adopt the methods of natural sciences wholesale for use in the social sciences. There's typically a structuralist ontological orientation, which means that, as I mentioned before, the notion of causality or of the role of individual freedom or choice are sort of downplayed. That is downplayed, and then causality is typically held to be very kind of minimalist. So if once you account for, say, race, gender, and class, education is still associated with people's income, and you can't think of any other possible covariates, then ipso facto causality runs from education to income. So I might have used ipso facto wrong there. So perils of being an academic. Sorry, it was weighing on my mind. Anyways, that's really all that's meant by causality in this way of thinking about things, which is a pretty minimalist definition. And kind of paradoxically, this approach, however, is really interested in that kind of minimalist form of causal analysis. So recovering causality through the use of regression analysis is, typically a pretty big part of what's known as quantitative research. There's also, when you think about the type of data gathered, this typically requires a large N or sample size and something like representative sampling. Now, all of these things are, generally speaking, associated with what I'm calling quantitative analysis, but I would say that this is not really adequate as a definition, and a lot of this stuff is shared with qualitative analysis as well. So some qualitative analysts might have this, they probably don't have a positivist epistemology, but they might have a structuralist ontology. In fact, they often do. Often enough anyways, even if it's less common. It can certainly be deductive. Sometimes people go study small groups of people and they have a really good idea in their heads of what they expect to find. That would make it deductive in a certain sense. They might very well be interested in causality, and they have to do some basic numeric analysis. It's just that these things tend to be more exaggerated in the quantitative analysis. Qualitative analysis, conversely, is more typically interpretive, so it's concerned with meaning rather than causality in a narrow sense. It's typically inductive. Again, probably more people go into a qualitative situation, or more people that call themselves qualitative researchers go into a research situation without necessarily having the clearest idea of what they expect to find. It often tends to have this kind of interpretivist epistemological orientation, which basically is a very fuzzy term that Bryman uses to mean, broadly speaking, that reality is in some sense not fully objective in the way that natural reality is. There's typically a constructionist ontological orientation, which means that generally speaking, it's held that social rules, for instance, are simply patterns of behavior. They're not things that are imposed on people from the outside, but that people are actors in the making of their own world. And this approach is typically interested in, social meaning and process, as I've mentioned. Usually there's a small sample size and what might be called purposive sampling. More on that later. So this is kind of the overall picture, right? Again, this is probably not sufficient as a rigorous definition. I think the definition I gave before really gets at the heart of it. Like if you really had to say, this is the common thing that almost everyone always means by qualitative versus quantitative, it has to do with really just the type of data that you have available. And then from that, typically certain types of analysis are more appropriate. And ironically enough, my advisor, Gay Seidman, who's in the department here, makes this point very often that a lot of times a lot of this stuff flows from the type of data you have. So you get a certain type of data that really lends itself to regression analysis. And then so you start thinking in terms that are answerable with those techniques. But it really, typically a lot of times people, get caught up in the type of data they have, and that oftentimes produces the analysis to a certain degree. Okay, so here's my take before. I kind of have already said all this stuff. These slides are a little repetitive, but basically all qualitative studies involve basic numeric analysis. Most quantitative studies require some kind of survey instrument where words are important, so it's really not as simple as numbers versus words, just to re-emphasize that. But again, the distinction basically means this. Quantitative data usually means the data are secondhand. There's relatively little free response, and the goal is to keep the number of possible responses to each question, so the possible outcomes of each variable, minimal. So a given quantity of data, if you think about a fixed quantity of information, and information is quantifiable, by the way. So if you think about a fixed quantity of information, that fixed quantity probably comes from, like, the dimensions of the data. You can think about it almost as like a matrix where each entry also has a sort of third dimension, where the rows are people, the columns are variables, and the third upstanding dimension is the number of possible responses. That quantity of data is going to get its heft, its volume basically, from a relatively large n, a relatively small k, or a number of columns, and a relatively small number of possible responses to the k, or this maybe third dimension. Qualitative data, conversely, are typically firsthand, and the goal is to avoid reducing the range of responses, so you aren't hoping to coerce responses into a fixed format. A given quantity of data typically has small n, large k, and an infinite number of possible responses, more or less. So this ends up looking similar enough to that traditional distinction. I'm not here to totally badmouth that distinction, but note that when people turn it into words versus numbers, that's way oversimplifying. There's a lot more that goes into it, and a lot of times, again, it just comes down to the form of data that you have. And to just say a little bit more about that actual difference, when we have people's own words, we tend to have few observations that are not an unbiased sample. When we have a large number of observations that are carefully chosen in ways that make them representative, we usually have form responses. So there are certain elective affinities, meaning things that aren't strict correspondences, but there's a high degree of correlation between all of these different kind of dimensions of the analysis. Sometimes with big data, you have combinations of these two types of things. So in the kind of internet of everything age, we do oftentimes have large quantities of people's own words with which we can actually use some basic mathematical techniques. But this is basically a post-2010 technique in what's called machine learning, or a cluster of related things: data science, neural networks, statistical learning. These all basically mean the same thing. Deep learning. But that's kind of a novel phenomenon, and it's novel precisely because it finally, like a lot of mixed methods research, so-called, is kind of a haphazard combination of these two techniques. Big data is maybe the first true mixed methods approach, and I think it's very exciting, although obviously there's certain threatening things about it too. But we'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the semester. So the Orn and Bell reading, I think, maybe gives you a flavor of this definition of qualitative research that you didn't previously have. Professor Bell, by the way, teaches in this department. And I think Jason Orn was a PhD student of his, so also a member of this department at one point. So just from reading this chapter, reading it for the exact meaning is in part sort of missing the point. Ironically, there's this emphasis on multiple logics in the text, and there's, generally speaking, a kind of free-flowing approach to truth. It's not saying that truth is any old thing, but the idea is that there are multiple truths. People are sort of living different experiences that all capture some dimension of reality. Questions about this material on a very practical note will be much more open to interpretation. By the way, I don't tell a lot of jokes in this class, but this is a really funny thing I found on the internet many years ago. It's just a comic about post-structuralism, which is a theoretical approach that is significantly more affiliated to qualitative than quantitative approaches. And you can see here this woman calling a hotline who says, "My son has been using the term knowledge in the plural. Should I be worried?" And the hotline operator is saying, "Unfortunately, this might be a symptom of reading Foucault. Refer to human nature in a conversation and observe your son's reaction." So the joke here is that post-structuralists would kind of look with great skepticism at any sort of concept about fixed human nature, or really any human nature at all. So yeah, this is an approach that's very much, as you can tell from the term post-structuralist, structuralism kind of having an elective affinity with the quantitative approach. This is a much more kind of qualitative approach. Anyways, I just thought this was kind of funny because of the frequent presence in qualitative research of plural forms of words that usually aren't plural, such as logic or knowledge or maybe epistemology, although that's oftentimes plural enough. I've got to think of one more good example. But anyways, if you kind of know you're looking at qualitative research if you see plural forms of words that are almost never plural. This is all joking and good fun, by the way. I think Professor Bell would probably find this very funny. Okay, so let's talk about what it is that qualitative research does well. Why would we want to take such an approach? Or why would we want to gather such data in the first place, which would lend itself to such an approach? Qualitative data capture non-confessional dimensions of reality better than do quantitative data. By non-confessional, I mean aspects of personal interactions that respondents might not report on a survey because they may not notice these things, because of social desirability bias, or it might just be very minute. They or the survey may not have the language for it, so researchers equipped with firsthand data and some knowledge of the theories of social psychology might more easily identify patterns that are hard to write questions about, or which respondents may not feel fully capable of without describing, without some kind of feedback or some kind of iterative dialogical process. Among the other strengths would be difficult to condense dimensions of reality, which is similar to what I mentioned before, but in this case, it might be something that people know about and don't mind talking about, but are simply difficult to really fully describe. So think about thick descriptions of someone's internal life. By the way, R is short for respondent in these situations. So thick descriptions of internal life. So compare that to a Likert item, which many people, for obvious reasons, find pretty disappointing in many ways. Likert items, by the way, are those kind of heat map things. So strongly agree to strongly disagree questions, basically. The trade-off is that qualitative analysis makes comparison harder, but the richness of the description typically is better for many purposes. You may also encounter in this way patterns not previously theorized. So to some extent, surveys, because they have this fixed form of responses, require the researcher to know what she hopes to find, or at least find out about prior to asking. And usually you have to have a pretty good idea of what you hope to find. Mechanisms, these are oftentimes, again, just by definition, easier to observe with qualitative data because quantitative analysis typically has a notion of causality that is simply really lends itself to an approach where you simply control for what can be controlled once you draw an appropriate causal diagram, and then whatever's left over is causal. That's, in one sense, just a definitional approach. If you read the sort of philosophy associated, like the deep philosophy of regression analysis, the work of Judea Pearl and Donald Rubin, this is pretty much definitional. It's kind of interesting that those guys actually have relatively, causality is a huge topic in philosophy, and statistical writers on this topic tend to have a disinterest in that philosophical dimension and tend to simply identify it with this counterfactual approach. So if, net of everything else, the presence of A causes B and the absence of A means that B does not happen, A causes B. It's just that simple. Obviously, there's more that could be said about the philosophy of causality. And just one more time, note that none of this stuff means that you'll never discuss numbers with qualitative analysis. Even this whole notion that there's a numerical dimension of reality and a non-numerical dimension is, I think, wrong. There are some dimensions where numbers are more or less useful descriptions of reality. All of reality is minimally numeric. It has the property of quantity. Sometimes that's basically all you want to know. So if you're talking about income, for instance, or especially think about not personal income, but the profits of a firm. Well, firms are profit-oriented enterprises. They have a market demand to produce profits for shareholders if they're publicly traded firms. They also have a legal responsibility to produce profits for shareholders if they're a publicly traded firm. And so a lot of times it's like, that pretty much drives a lot of their behavior. It's not that, wrong to think that we can describe, their cash flow, their costs, their net revenue or profit. These things, more or less are good guides to how the capitalist economy works. But other dimensions of social life, these might be reductive. So that's kind of what we want to think about it as. So let's talk about qualitative analysis proper now. I want to describe to you some of the unique sampling strategies that qualitative analysis uses in place of what might be considered representative sampling. So in particular, probability sampling, which is a very specific form of representative sampling, is rarely used in qualitative research, especially not in ethnography, which is basically a deep form of observation, of all aspects of life, so going beyond an interview. Purposive sampling is going to be the sort of more common alternative. Purposive sampling is non-probability, so it means that you're not selecting people at random, you don't worry so much about the, or if not at random, the other form of probability sampling means that people have a known probability of entering the sample. This is not the case with purposive sampling. Instead, we have a strategic selection of units with direct reference to the research question being asked. You might think about it as answering the question, who or which case can best help answer my questions, so it tends to be pretty theory-driven. A little bit more kind of about that. So there's sort of this alternative logic of sampling and claims. For instance, you might look for maximum variation. So you document variation and identify important patterns, so you try to get a whole range of things. For instance, a classic text on this is the Hall and Soska's book, Varieties of Capitalism, which seeks to document maybe not maximum variation, but is principally concerned with, as the title would indicate, different varieties of capitalism. So it's a book about national economies, basically. And this is an approach where the goal is not necessarily to find the most representative economic system out of all of them, but instead to just document everything that exists within reason. You might also think about an approach of theoretical sampling. So this is selecting settings, people, events, time periods, etc., on the basis of their representation of some important theoretical construct. Almost all examples of actual qualitative studies to some extent involve this logic. And by the way, these logics can all be paired. Another logic of sampling would be the ideal typical case, to use a Weberian phrase. Weberian, by the way, means having to do with Weber, which is the name W-E-B-E-R. A lot of times that's intimidating, even to some PhD students, let alone undergrads, because that name is not pronounced in the current way it's said, which is the correct German way, more or less, the way it looks in English pronunciation. So that name is Weber, just to kind of let everyone in on one of those stupid gatekeeping things. Okay, so in this kind of ideal typical form of reasoning, we try to think about not only what patterns are common, but how some particular case really well illustrates a point. So you can think about this as a form of sampling that's non-random, but is ideally representative in a hyper focused way, basically. So for instance, book, I'm kind of using this Varieties of Capitalism literature that I was interested in a few years ago. A book to that effect is this by Jonas Pontusson, The Limits of Social Democracy, which is basically a book that makes the case that Sweden is sort of like the ideal form in a certain respect of social democracy. So it's an extreme case, but it's one that he thinks is quite representative in certain respects, just sort of exaggerated. So like the pure form of a thing, basically. That's kind of what ideal typical means. So that's one approach to sampling. Or you could kind of go the opposite direction and think about an aberrant case. So in this example, you would still use something extreme, but you would kind of own up to how extreme it is. So rather than saying, well, this is a pure form, and yes, it's extreme, but in certain ways it's just an exaggerated form, you might be saying, no, this is a weird case, but what would it take to make this a typical case? Why does this differ? How does this differ? So this is a slightly different literature. Sorry about the siren there, by the way. But the Voss and Sherman paper is a classic paper in, I think, AJS, American Journal of Sociology, Breaking the Iron Law of Oligarchy, Union Revitalization in the American Labor Movement, which takes on the case of kind of a rare situation where a union that's very, very old and had a pretty entrenched leadership structure managed to kind of keep that structure vital, as the title puts it. And they freely admit that this is kind of an atypical case, so it's a very interesting paper. Okay, so here's an example comparison of those kind of quantitative and qualitative approaches that you have a better sense of how they differ. So for instance, a quantitative study of welfare states, which is kind of in that Varieties of Capitalism literature, might be this by Corpy, 1989, very famous paper. He basically studies the decommodification of different welfare systems, so the extent to which welfare systems directly provision goods and services to recipients rather than provide them through the market. So basically things like you might have a single payer system of healthcare where the state also operates a lot of the healthcare system, sometimes called socialized healthcare, as opposed to, say, giving everyone a voucher with which they can buy healthcare, which is to an extent the way the American system works, or the way that the Canadian system works to some extent. So you basically come up with some kind of quantitative index of decommodification. You pile things into a scale, as we've learned in this class. You would draw a directed acyclic graph or a causal diagram, to use the sort of less pedantic name for it. And then you would obtain data. You'd fit a regression model using software such as Stata, Python, or R, and then you would interpret. or SPSS and SAS for that matter. That would be a quantitative approach to a question. What would a qualitative study of welfare states look like? And note, by the way, that these are kind of macro qualitative things. So these don't really involve ethnography or interviews, but they involve qualitative data in the sense that we're not really like taking people's language, or in this case, is not so much language as like legal policies, but we're not trying to turn those into one-dimensional, basically, outcomes that we could model using a whole set of numeric covariates. We're trying to sort of take them in their totality. So here's an example of a kind of sub-literature or micro-literature on welfare states. Sombart, Werner Sombart's paper, it's actually a book, is a classic kind of text about the lack of social democracy in the United States, and there's a lot of follow-up. So a recent take on this from 110 years later, Barry Eidland's book. These are books that kind of take the, some inspiration from this quantitative literature. Why does the United States not have much social democracy? But what they do is they study it in a way that doesn't do anything like try to, or doesn't primarily try to reduce this outcome to a numeric one that can be modeled. So that's what makes it qualitative. Another good example of this would be to pick a perceived typical case, even if it's ideal. So again, picking an extreme case just sort of depends on how you conceptualize it. Svensson's book, 2001, is another kind of classic text. I think it's called Capitalists Against Markets, if memory serves, about the case of Sweden. So these would be kind of two ways to approach the study of the same topic that come from very different angles, and they're both pretty interesting. The way that these books all sort of work is they use comparisons or counterfactual reasoning to draw inference, but it's more of a logical form of inference, the imagining of possible worlds, rather than basically the use of regression analysis, for instance. So let's talk a little bit about sort of the mechanics of qualitative analysis. First question that's pretty interesting is, what should our N be? So this is kind of tough to answer using statistical criteria, but here are some other possibilities. How many cases would give us confidence in our analytic generalization? Now, this is a bit of a fuzzy question with a fuzzy set of answers. By the way, not a fuzzy set in the strict sense, but a set of answers that are fuzzy. But this is at least one kind of stimulus to thought, so to speak. How rich and complex is the information you get from each case? Or in other words, just how much information do you get from each case? When do I reach theoretical saturation? So the point at which a new case provides little or no surprising information. So that's one way to think about sample size. How about rigor? So how do we make this analysis rigorous at all? And you might worry about that because it's not totally obvious. You might think about the problem of internal validity that we encountered in our study of scales. So what is it that makes a study operate according to some kind of analytical logic that makes sense or is generalizable? You can reconceptualize this for qualitative studies as credibility. In other words, how well supported are our arguments and interpretations? You can think about maybe using the tools of traditional logic, right? Do our inferences follow known logical patterns, or do they commit logical blunders? You might also think about the problem of external validity, which you could reconceptualize for qualitative studies as transferability. Basically what this means is, how well do our conclusions generalize, not just is our form of analysis valid. And in this particular case, you have to think about, again, sort of like maybe almost like taking, other situations and coming up with 5 key properties. Obviously, you have to keep it sort of small to make it manageable, but 5 key properties, say, that obtained in the particular case which we analyzed, do those obtain in some other case, right? So sort of, again, a logical rather than a statistical form of inference. You can also think about another type of rigor entirely, which is something that we discussed in the data analysis section, but I didn't spend enough time on probably, which is you can kind of think about research ethics. Not just how well do you treat your subjects, which is a topic we'll come to later, but how transparent and auditable and dependable is your analysis? So how accountable are you to your subjects, but also to other researchers? Do you make your records available? Do you make your research notes in a suitably anonymized form available to others? You could also think about even a kind of political stakes of analysis. So the impact and importance, does this contribute to the scientific literature? Does it contribute to the community on which the study was conducted, or even just society at large? And then you can think a little bit more about the sources of credibility. So this kind of speaks to all four of the issues I just mentioned. Where did these things come from? Again, just to say a little bit more about this in detail. Rich data supplied in abundance. This is a phrase I can't take credit for. It comes from Professor Chae-Yoon Lim, who teaches in this department. Basically what this means is, did you actually use qualitative data correctly to get as much information out of the situation, with ethical approaches in mind, as you could, right? Did you actually use people's own words as much as you could? Did you try to get as many different perspectives, as many different logics as you could? And did you compute what might be called quasi-statistics? So did you make some effort to verify things with, tallying up information? Kind of on that note, you can think about making sure to carefully document everything you do, and triangulation. And what this means basically is, when you calculate these quasi-statistics, do you cross-check people? Do you basically, when someone says, yeah, that person got fired for union organizing, do you go ask that person? Do you ask other coworkers? Do you ask management at the firm, etc.? And, do you consider that any of those people might have their own reasons to say yes or no? Do you engage in inconvenience sampling? So do you ever seek out negative cases? Do you seek out cases that seem to trouble your perspective, and then do you follow up on them? Do you account for alternative explanations? So just in the same way you might do with regression analysis, do you consider that an association is not necessarily causation? Do you consider that, again, sometimes people, the truth might be between everything that all of your subjects say when taken together? You can kind of go the opposite direction and also think about, do you ask people themselves to validate your analysis? So do you give people back your account of their own words? And, ideally, what they'll say is, yeah, you really brought out something that hadn't occurred to me, but do you let them have the chance to do that? Do you engage in reflexivity? So, in other words, do you basically ask yourself, what role am I playing in the analysis, especially if you're a participant observer? Do you fact check? So sometimes this is, in a way, just going beyond triangulation, not just asking other participants, but if people claim things to you that in principle could be looked up with an entirely separate third party, someone who's not a part of the study in any way, do you go check those sources? Finally, we can talk a little bit about sources of transferability. It might be worthwhile to contrast this with statistical inference. So statistical inference, we're drawing conclusions about a population from the sample, as you might recall, hopefully recall, since it was very recent. It relies on the properties of random sampling, right? So the idea that the sample differs from the population only by random error, at least once you account for sample design. It requires some amount of random sampling at some point in the process. And here, sampling bias and also variance are sort of the key concerns. With qualitative analysis, the point is to draw conclusions about the linkages between characteristics in terms of some explanatory schema. I forget where I got that quote, but that's a nice description from a qualitative research paper. Basically, the idea is we want to identify processes and mechanisms that we think generalize. So we observe close up how it actually is that education helps people obtain a higher wage. Does it give them more skills? Does it give them more bargaining power? Does it help them perform some kind of cultural competency that is important to employers for their image? That sort of thing that we would hope is something that can generalize in some way to other people. That's a way to think about transferability. You can also think about, just generally speaking, logical inference. So am I able to say, well, because this person is in X, Y, and Z ways a relatively typical member of their group, even if, I need to draw on some amount of statistical reasoning there, then can I infer that all else being equal, this set of actions tends to lead to this set of outcomes, basically. So now let's turn to a brief discussion of in-depth interviews. Now for our class, if you're watching this and you're a member of SOC257 in the summer of 2023, we are not going to do these. I just want you to be aware of these techniques. Much of this is pretty similar to crafting a good survey anyways. There are parts that aren't so similar though. Here I just want you to be aware of what researchers actually do so that we can discuss these things in class. What follows will be material that I go over relatively quickly in this lecture. I just want to give you a gentle introduction to these techniques. They're pretty applicable practical skills, I think. Okay, so why would you do an in-depth interview? This is a little more abstract and worth a little more discussion. You might want to explore new or emerging patterns, so situations where it's difficult to simply ask a fixed set of questions about something. You might want to try to get at emotional experiences, so revealing contradictions and ambivalence, basically a situation where there's contestation about some issue. You might want to try to uncover the meanings that people give to their circumstances in their own words in particular, so not restricting them to a liquid item. On that note, you might just generally be interested in exploring views about sensitive topics in a complex and nuanced way. You might be interested in people's motivations and the justification they give for, oftentimes in the case of controversial behavior. You might be interested in studying marginal populations, which are difficult at times to get at through, say, survey research, and even then, you may not wish to use those techniques to study groups such as those, in case you're interested in, for instance, the experience of being a minority. That might not be easy to communicate as well over a survey. And finally, you might also be interested in how a social process works. Here's a guide to the types of interviews that people conduct, and these are terms of art that are useful to know. This first one here, you can sort of think about it as, you really here have kind of two extremes, the fully structured and unstructured. Neither of these is really used very often in practice. The fully structured interview, basically, you ask questions in a predetermined order. You, generally speaking, don't ask follow-ups unless it's part of the guide. You have... in the case of forced choice responses, this is just a survey. If you write down whatever people actually tell you, then it's really an interview. The benefit of this is that you would have standardization because you minimize the interviewer effects, you allow for comparisons, but this obviously is somewhat, stultifying. If you think about the opposite end, the fully unstructured interview, basically you let the participant drive the bus. It's basically an ordinary conversation. A lot of times you get these with ethnographic studies. So in the case of a long-term ethnographic study, someone's living with a particular group for many, many years, you'll see this happen from time to time. People just end up talking about something and it ends up in the research, but it's not in any way a conversation that was meant to happen explicitly. The problem here is that these can be difficult to compare, difficult to sort of verify. So what's most common is what's called the semi-structured interview. It's mostly open-ended questions. You have topics and questions chosen beforehand, but their order and whether or not you ask follow-up questions is determined by the sort of flow of the interview, the music of conversation. And these, obviously are sort of the most flexible form without basically sacrificing the usefulness of having at least some rough idea of what you want to talk about before you begin an interview. So they're the most common because they're basically the best of both worlds by a long shot. So what do those guides look like? What do interview guides look like? What is the purpose of these things? What you're trying to do here is facilitate some kind of balance between systematic data collection and the flexibility of a real-life conversation to get at people's tacit knowledge. So they're systematic in that they help focus the interview, they ensure comparability across interviews, but they're flexible in that you don't really need to follow the guide rigidly. So again, this sort of leads to that semi-structured interview. Basically, I'm just saying things here out loud that I said, or writing things down that I said out loud before. Okay, and I mentioned all this before. So interviews, generally speaking, should start with introductions. Again, we're getting in a little bit into the nitty-gritty here, so I'll just briefly say, if you're doing this in real life or you're reading about research, you may hear about these introductions, you may need to have one of these things. Basically, especially important part of this is that this is where also the informed consent is derived for these interviews, and some of you even put these in your surveys as well, which is completely fine. It's a good idea to get people's consent. These also typically briefly explain the topic of the interview. They give people the amount of time it's going to take. They explain what will happen with the data that's being used, and then you actually ask for the direct consent, and you reassure the respondent that you're not going to do anything unethical, which you obviously shouldn't do, and then at that point you also remind them that they can walk. It's a little bit, in a way, like a police interview. You kind of go through all of these, sort of Miranda right analogs, basically. So you'll hear a reference to these kind of introductions to interviews. this is an example. This is drawn from Silva 2013. You can pause the video here if you're interested in looking at what these things look like. Okay, so some interview tips. I'm going to, again, really blaze through these because we're not going to end up putting these into practice, but this is what good interviews look like, so you sort of have a sense of what people are doing when you read about interview projects. So generally speaking, interviews should make use of open-ended questions. That's sort of the whole point in a certain respect. Sometimes closed-ended questions can be useful as a kind of starting point, getting someone to really lay it out on the line. But for the most part, you're going to want to use these open-ended questions. Also, and some of these tips, by the way, are going to be reprints from our survey research section. You should avoid leading or loaded questions. We've been over this sort of thing before, so I'm going to skip over it without too much hassle. You should also, generally speaking, start with easier questions. I think I mentioned this for the survey research approach, and some groups, again, did this. So easier questions might just be, for some people, although not everyone, basic demographic information. For other groups, that could be sensitive. It depends. Generally speaking, the reason to start with easier questions, though, is that you want to get people warmed up. You want to make sure that people feel comfortable with you, and this is oftentimes an important part of the interview process, although sometimes some combativeness can be useful, too. Generally speaking, you want to make sure that you have clear questions. So the last time we talked about this, we talked about the fact that you shouldn't, generally speaking, ask people technical questions that they're not going to know the answer to, or if they do know the answer, they don't have any special insight. So, for instance, just thinking about what's in the news today, the Oppenheimer film is a pretty big deal. If you're interviewing a nuclear physicist and you want their opinion about a project they're working on, they might be the right person to ask, because you might want to get a sense of, well, how did a particular person conceptualize the development of the atomic bomb, for instance. But generally speaking, if you're asking, say, someone who happens to work in a school, who's maybe a member of the teachers union, how exactly the budget gets made, if this person's just a rank and file member, they may not have any special expertise about that, even though they care about it in a general sense and might understand the general format. So a good example of that, too, might be if you're asking, say, questions about, let's say, gender, for instance. You don't want to ask people things. Sorry, this is kind of a separate point, but this other piece of advice I meant to mention is that you should avoid asking terms of art when you can. So don't use sociological jargon, basically, or political scientific jargon. Don't ask people what their gender ideology is. Instead, you want to ask something like concrete. So what do you think the proper role for a woman or a man is, etc. Again, order matters, as in math, as in interviews. So generally speaking, questions should flow logically. You should have transitions between sections. If you have random ideas, try to at least put them into an odds and ends section. But at the same time, you want to be flexible. Keep in mind that priming can change people's answers. So this is kind of the classic case. I think it was in one of the readings recently. If not, it might have been in a survey research textbook I was reviewing earlier. But for instance, if you ask people whether or not they're trying to lose weight, but you, prior to asking that, ask them what their best estimate of their weight is, if you ask them the best estimate, the percentage of people, not the percent change, but the percentage point change of people who say they're trying to lose weight is about 12. So basically, 60% of people will say yes instead of 48, something like that. So order can matter. Be careful about priming. Here's some examples, by the way, about an interview guide, and then some of the different ways that the order might matter, for instance. So when asking about family history, you might want to establish a logical order here, and same with work history and leisure, etc. Concluding remarks. So anytime you finish up the interview, you should always ask people if there's anything else that they think you should know about the topic, and also make sure to thank them for their time. You'll be surprised when you provide contact information how many people will remember something right after the interview. When I took a course with Professor Bell, whose text we're reading for today, he gave a number of good examples, unfortunately none of which I can remember, but he gave a number of good examples of cases where in his own research, he does qualitative research, I don't personally do a lot of it, where many people had, phoned him up afterwards or said, hey, yeah, there was this one more crazy thing I got to tell you about. So be open. Kind of going back behind the scenes a little bit, you also want to pre-test your questions. So before you ever even get started, check and see, how these go over with a sympathetic audience, someone who's kind of on your side, and then you want to refine as needed, right? So make sure that you have a sense of what this actually produces in people, and it also gets you familiar with the interview guide. It's a little bit like preparing a lecture, for instance. Now, at this point, I want to go over some of the types of questions people ask. And again, these will just be helpful in giving you a sense of how the sausage gets made in the actual world of sociology and social science. So a common type of question that people typically begin with might be a grand tour question. So you basically just say, how would you describe, you, the research participant, the setting, event, activity, or whatever, to someone who's unfamiliar with it? Kind of offers the opportunity for a respondent to say what they think is relevant or germane about a particular situation without the interviewer leading them. There's some alternatives to typical day questions, etc. So these are pretty common to see. You also often see example questions. So these are questions where researchers will basically ask for, whether or not they actually need an example of an incident or experience. And it might well be the case that the researcher knows perfectly what the person is talking about, but they want to hear from the participant some additional information because that might be an insight into that person's psychology. It might be an insight into the way that this person uses that word, sort of the contextual meaning of that word, even if the researcher knows, totally fine, like knows the meaning of the word that the person is talking about. So a lot of times playing dumb a little bit can be a useful technique, is a way to generalize that. The subjective experience questions are pretty straightforward. You just ask people how they subjectively experienced an event. Counterfactual questions can also be really useful. These are sort of like doing a little bit of regression analysis in a way, using this kind of counterfactual approach, but you're just asking people about it instead. So generically, these look like, what would such and such be like if such and such other thing didn't happen? It helps people consider aspects of their life that they might otherwise take for granted, and it's useful for exploring what a respondent thinks about something. It's useful for also, in some cases, maybe exploring some further causal ideas on your own. You've also got comparison questions. So these are ones where you just straight up ask people, how would you compare X to Y? Pretty straightforward, but it allows another situation where respondents can sort of think about, people tend to take things for granted. And they don't necessarily take them for granted in their own minds, but they might take it for granted that everything that they know about a particular situation. And that's not to knock ordinary people. All of us, I think, have just a human habit to assume that other people are as keyed in to our own obsessions and passions as we are. Sometimes it might just be obvious to you, well, of course I had to move back home at that point because my mother got sick, because in our particular religious community, caring for one's parents is an especially sacred duty, and that might just be something that other people don't necessarily know. So this is the point of these kind of comparison questions. The no limits questions, these are kind of fun. They sound like gambling, and in a way they are a bit of a gamble. Basically, you can kind of frame these as like almost a little bit like those kind of disarming questions we talked about before with survey research, where you preface a difficult question with some kind of maybe a kind of vignette, basically, where you say, some people drink and drive occasionally, and although it's a really bad idea, it's not totally rare. Have you ever done anything like this? The point being that you obviously don't want to normalize this, but you want to sort of set people at ease, make it feel like they can be honest, and give them some, factual information that, very unfortunately, that is a not totally uncommon event. So this is a little bit similar to that. This, is generically used when people are asking about sensitive topics. Probe questions. So these are, in a way, some of the most important questions in the interview process itself. Basically, what's happening here is you're just poking a little bit more. Probes, in general, are just sort of any type of follow-up question in a way. So you can think about this as almost a higher level category that encompasses a lot of the other things we've talked about. An example here comes from Gerson. So different people want different things out of their jobs. What are the things that you feel yourself are most important in a job? And then the probe is sort of like you can almost attach it as a writer to any particular question. So you're just kind of poking people a little bit. You're prodding them. Why do you say that? What about this? What about that? You can almost challenge people a little bit in a way that is part of active and exciting conversations in real life. You're just, as a researcher, being a little more deliberate about this. I've got some generic tips for conducting interviews as well. These are pretty straightforward. You want to have a quiet place, listen actively, follow up, keep the conversation going, use nonverbal cues. By the way, these are all just kind of generically good conversation tips. By the way, if you're looking to impress someone on a date or something, or make a new friend, interview tips are kind of a subset of just like general life tips about how to be an affable, gregarious person. But conversely, you want to enjoy the silence. So as much as you want to follow up, keep the conversation going, make eye contact, blah, 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 you also sometimes don't need to be, on the ball every single second. And indeed, that can drive people a little bit crazy. So avoid the temptation to fill dead air. Keep in mind that, you're not the one thinking about the responses to the question. You're the one who's really eager to get that information, but the other person is the person who obviously is taking time to think about things. Try to avoid interrupting people. Again, sometimes strategic interruption can be sort of useful, but definitely play that by ear. Keep in mind that 90% of the time people don't like to be interrupted, and it's usually, if you're interrupting someone, you should at a minimum try to affirm. Like if you really want to affirm something that someone is saying that might be challenging or scary, that's one thing, but definitely if you're differing from them, at least let them finish what they're saying. Some further tips: battle the "you know what I mean" response. So basically, this is prodding. When people kind of wave their hands literally or figuratively, or tell you, yeah, it was that type of thing, or it was one of those whole deals. That's a sign actually that you should really dive in right at that particular moment, because that's a place where the person is assuming that you have some kind of detailed contextual or tacit knowledge that they in fact possess, that you really want to get access to, and this person, probably doesn't mind sharing, but they simply assume that you know it already, and very likely you don't. So make sure to be on guard for that. Generally speaking, you also want to avoid taking a judgmental tone or stance. This kind of goes along with being affable, not interrupting people unless you're trying to back them up. Avoid too much challenge. A little bit is okay, but there's a difference between challenging someone to be more explicit or direct or more logical in their reasoning, etc., versus simply saying, sharing your own kind of moral stance on particular things. So avoid this. Taking notes, obviously super important. I'd say a ton about taking notes if this were a class where we actually did these things, because that can be obviously very difficult. You should just know that you should do it. And then you'll also want to code those notes. We will talk a little bit about coding, or at least I'll present a little bit about coding on Wednesday. And that basically wraps it up. So I want to try to summarize all of that. I know that was a lot all at once, but basically the idea here is that interview tips are typically quite similar to survey tips. They're also similar to tips for just being a good conversationalist. It's important to know just how much of an art this is. So anytime you read the results of an interview process, there's a whole lot that went into this. And there's a whole lot that, maybe it would be slightly different, or in some cases possibly very different, depending on the person's technique. So even though it can seem like, well, wow, this is great, we don't have these stupid fixed survey responses, we don't have to learn what all these dumb capital and lowercase sigmas mean, and why do those two things mean something totally different? I get it, that's annoying. But conversely, there's also, tons of kind of frisson in the qualitative research process as well that can be very irritating sometimes when you realize just how subjective and contingent it is, how many logics there are, to use a phrase of Orrin and Bell's. So thanks everyone for watching. Hope this was a useful discussion of qualitative research generally, and then a little bit about interviews. See you next time for a discussion of qualitative coding.